Welcome back, Martin again. So a couple of years ago when I was in Japan, I was thinking of what to do for Pi Day, and I was looking out Mount Fuji, and it struck me I should do something very Japanese. And I thought, what is Japanese? Haikus are Japanese. So what is a haiku? It's a poem with syllable count 575. And I thought, why 575? What if we did 314? What if we did 314159? What if the poem never ended? So I came up with the idea of a piku. And every track on this album has a piku associated with it that Emma wrote. And this piku is the first one for the first track. There you go, straight. Number me not, scales, there is more of me to forget than you can remember. So the first track is called 314 because this is where it starts. And what the track does is it looks at the first 282 digits of pi, which you see here. And it approaches them from the point of view of, well, 3 is familiar because 3 is the first digit. Most people know what the first number of pi is, but most people don't know what the 282nd digit of pi is. And so as we progress through these digits, as we play these digits, we enter into unfamiliar territory. And so the music goes from a very systematic encoding of the digits. The digits are sent to their octave Cs, so 3 becomes C3, 1 becomes C1, and so on. A couple of notes are unplayable on the piano, including a C9. There is no C9, and there's no C0, so those are played as rests. And as we go through these digits, and as we accumulate the number of times we've seen the digits, so for example, the 4th digit is a 1, which we've now seen twice. What Greg is doing is he's changing the pitch of the notes, he's changing the articulation of the note, he's changing the volume of the note, and so this is something called serialism that he'll talk about. And by the time we'll get to digit 282, you'll see that the notes that were originally mapped onto their Cs, at least in terms of their pitches, are now very different. But what we do is every time there's a 3, we always play that as a C3 because we want to cue to the idea that there's still something familiar in pi. So, Greg, what is serialism? How does that work? And what kinds of things can we change about a note other than its pitch?
Mm-hmm. So serialism was a technique developed in the early 20th century by a German composer called Arnold Schoenberg. And he applied that technique of serialism strictly to pitch. So just taking the 12 notes of the chromatic scale, putting them in an order that wasn't related to a diatonic scale, for instance, and then using that tone row, as it was called, to generate the melodic and harmonic material for the piece, which was a very different approach to anything that had come before him historically. 50 years later, composers like Pierre Boulez and Karl Stockhausen applied that serial technique to other elements of music, such as dynamics, articulation, and rhythm. And so I thought that this would be a good way to kind of generate this idea of starting somewhere familiar, but then ending up in a very kind of foreign place.
All right, let's take a look at the score.
Martin's beautiful score.
Greg's beautiful music. I have.
Sure.
Yeah. If you see mistakes, I blame Sibelius and myself.
Blemish-free.
Blemish-free. So what you're seeing is you're seeing these notes, and each of those notes corresponds to a digit of pi, all the way to 282nd digit. Mm-hmm. And you're seeing the beginning, which is a C3. That is a C3, C1, and so on. First of all, go ahead.
Maybe we should just make that a little more clear. So this is the first digit, C3, C1, C4, and then that is
a C1. So 3, 1, 4, 1. That's a C5, and so
on. And all of these notes are in fact C.
They are Cs.
We are establishing a tonal center of C in the early seconds of this piece. So you do get some sense of a tonal center.
Excellent. What is poco a poco? That sounds like a couple of little chihuahuas.
It does. It's not. Poco a poco means little by little.
Yeah.
Slowly accelerate to the end of the piece. So this is quite a short piece, and I'll go into reasons for that.
So every
later.
piece has kind of instructions to the performer.
Indeed, which is a typical thing for a piece of music. Some of them can be quite abstract, like Satie's work, as we'll get to in a little bit. Some of them are very literal, slowly, quickly, etc., etc. It's a little bit unusual for a piece to start at one tempo and then accelerate to the end. It's not completely unheard of, but it's not a typical kind of musical technique that you would find.
Okay, so all the notes are 8 notes.
Correct.
And what are these? There's some markings here. What is PP? What is PPP? What is FF?
Okay, so this is the way that musicians and composers denote dynamics or volume changes. So PP is pianissimo. Triple P, I'm not exactly... I can't remember what that stands for, but I think it's just generally stated as triple P. FF is...
Petit pianissimo.
Perhaps. I'm not sure. And then fortissimo, forte, mezzo forte, so medium loud, etc., etc. And it's kind of it's a feature of this multiple serial technique that we have constantly changing dynamic markings. Often in a piece of music, you'll just have one dynamic at the start that will last through a good portion of the piece, but here it's changing every note, which is a feature of.
So, for example, the first C1 is an MP, and then as you serialize the volume, it now goes to an MF.
Correct.
And I mean, I'm not a great piano player. I'm not even a good piano player. But does a piano player, can they keep up with these changing volume markings as they play something like this?
That's a really good question. You can see here we have a metronome marking of 240. So it's quite fast. You could easily play this piece a lot slower to encode the dynamics. But this is a piece, if you were to play it at 240, you would have to learn it by muscle memory. So, yeah, it is a challenge in that respect.
Okay, so the volume is changing.
Correct.
And there are these other markings here, which do look a little bit mysterious. So there are these greater than signs above notes. There are these hats. There is what looks like a T here. What are those?
These are what's called articulation markings. So this is an accent. So the pianist is instructed to play with a little more force than MF would denote. So it has a little more attack and stronger sound. Here, this is called marcato, which is a degree stronger than accent and an accent. So it's the same kind of idea, just with a little more force. This mark, let's just go back to this one here. This is a staccato dot on top of the note. And that means to play the note short. Staccato meaning short in Italian. And this note, or this articulation here, is staccatissimo. So as short as possible.
As short as possible. And then we have an underscore, which we sometimes see like here.
Ah, yes.
And what is that underscore?
That's a tenuto mark. And that tells the pianist to hold the note for the full value, full rhythmic value.
So this is fascinating, because even though we have an eighth note, which in some way sets the length of the note, and there's no way that note can then run into the next eighth note, as long as it's an eighth note, there are still subtle variations that we can apply in terms of its length. We can staccato and staccatissimo, and we can make those subtle changes. And so how do the volume markings like MF interact with the accents? Because does that accent make the MF a little bit louder but not as loud as an F, or does it make it as loud as an F?
That's a really good question. I would say that the general level of dynamic is set by the dynamic marking, as in mezzo forte, forte. The accent is like a subset of that. Whether it approaches an F, I would say probably not. I mean, these things are not really objective kind of set in stone things. They're much more malleable and fluid and depend on the context of the
So if we have a volume range and here is MF and here is F, then an accented MF would be somewhere in here?
Probably.
Would be
Yeah.
somewhere in here. Here would
Yeah.
be an accented MF.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this page, this does go on for 3 pages. There is more notes, and as you can see, there's almost no C's perhaps that are left to be seen here.
I
Yeah.
just want to draw your... So a big part of the sound of this style of music is the really large pitch range. So here, I think it's really hard to see, but it's probably a C8, the top note of the piano. And then the very next note is, it's probably an A, I don't know, A flat maybe, B flat. So we're going from the very top, pianissimo, to the very bottom of the range of the piano, forte with an accent. So we're really exploiting the pitch and dynamic range of the piano.
So sometimes what you see in music, and which we'll see in other scores, is assistance to the performer in trying to interpret what the pitch is of this note. And so you'd see an 8VA indicating to play a note an octave higher than what it would normally be annotated. This lets you get rid of some of these ledger lines.
Yeah, makes it a little more friendly for the performer.
But in this case, the
We're not
goal,
being friendly.
we're not being friendly. So we come to the end of the piece here. This is digit 282. And if you listen to it, the notes have kind of come at you pretty quickly towards the end, don't they?
Absolutely. Well, the accelerando, by the time we get to the end of the piece, we're kind of as fast as the piece is going to be. So one other point that I just kind of wanted to mention briefly is the way that pitch is serialized. So we started at the beginning of the piece with this central axis, this tonal center of C, which you can see up to... Where's the first non-C? It is a C sharp. So every note up to this point here is a C, and then we hear this marcato C sharp, and that is really the first point where we're moving away from C. And that's based on the occurrence of each digit. So this would have been the 5th occurrence of, C2. I guess.
Something like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
As we progress through the piece, so we have like this central axis of C. And every time we go through a group of 5 or 10 occurrences, the pitch moves up and down above and below that central axis. So that by the time we get to the end of the piece, we have these notes here, F sharp, lots of F sharps. And F sharp is a tritone away from C. So tonally, we're as far apart.
Here are F sharps, yeah.
Yeah, so tonally, when we get to F sharp, or harmonically speaking, we're as far away from C as possible. So that's the reasoning.
The tritone, you mentioned the tritone. Isn't that the devil's interval?
It is the devil's interval, yeah.
Should we,
Well,
can we talk about the devil's interval?
Okay. Well, we're not in church, so it's okay, I think.
Well, we're in the Church of Music, so what's the deal with the tritone?
Well, the tritone is a dissonant interval, which means that it sounds unpleasant to our ears. And yeah, it was used very cautiously throughout music history and very specifically. In the period that Marn's talking about, when it was considered the devil's interval, you could really only sing or play consonant intervals such as octaves, fifths. So anything that sounded dissonant, like a tritone, was just out of bounds. You couldn't do it. But here in our piece, when we get to that point, when we're hearing F sharps, we're at the furthest point from the beginning, so we're in unfamiliar tonal territory. So for me, that was just a really good place to end the piece, even though it's quite short.
Well, we do have to end it somewhere.
Indeed.
And we do have to end this video somewhere.
I think we do, yeah.
We do. So we're going to walk on to the next track. Let's take a look at that.